I'm fine, thank you.
Great.
Everything okay?
I'm just wondering, should I start? Okay. So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Paul Nemitz from the European Commission. Mr. Paul Nemitz is an experienced lawyer and leader of public policy projects in the European Commission and in nonprofit organizations. He is the lead director for putting in place the GDPR, negotiator of the EU-US Privacy Shield and the EU Code of Conduct against hate speech and xenophobia with major tech companies. An experienced foundation chair and board member of nonprofits, he focuses on democracy, technology, and the law, AI law and ethics, media, and remembrance. Mr. Nemitz is an author and speaker and visiting professor at the College of Europe and fellow of Brussels University. We are so grateful to have you with us today, Mr. Nemitz, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I have followed the previous panel, and I must say it was quite a good discussion with many controversial statements and controversial discussions, but of great interest. Let me focus a little bit on the very specific European experience in the triangle between democracy, the rule of law, and technology. And this is an experience which is a difficult experience. It's not a perfect experience, but we are trying to struggle, I think, exactly with the same issues that you are also struggling with in the seminar, and which also have been discussed at detail and with great expertise in the previous panel. And let me be clear that the solutions which we have found or which we are envisaging are by no means perfect. This is a constant debate also in Europe with very controversial views. But in the end, the decisions in our process are made as normal in a parliamentary democracy by the legislator. And let me just bring you up to date on the choices the legislators have made. And for me, it's important to talk about the legislator first, so the regulator, if one wants to call it, although that's a terminology which in America exactly doesn't mean Congress, it means regulatory authorities like the FTC. So I'm not so keen on the word regulator. I consciously use the word legislator because for me, the whole debate which we're having between technology and the rules which pertain to the technology and which technology needs to follow is a debate about the question, do we accept the primacy of democracy over technology and business models? And for me, that is not, therefore, a first question of ethics. I would say, and I've been myself a member, for example, of the German Data Ethics Commission, and in the European Commission, we had a few years ago a high-level group on ethics in artificial intelligence, which I have also worked with. These discussions on ethics, of course, are important, but there is an element of, let's say, a sponsored effort, sponsored by industry in particular, to try to get the political element, the democratic political element out of the discussion by pretending that ethics can solve it all. And I don't share this view, and I don't think that the European legislator and those people who are engaged in the democratic process share this view, because in the end, we need rules which have democratic legitimacy. And there are other considerations in the democratic rulemaking than ethics. These considerations often are a mixture between economic considerations, considerations of ability to innovate, competitiveness, but also legal considerations like how do we protect our rights, fundamental rights of people, which are written down in catalogs of fundamental rights in constitutions. How do we maintain a democracy functioning in the age of AI in the age in which we don't know anymore whether the texts which praise a candidate for election are made by a human being, thus a participant in democracy, or by a machine, which is used by others, but which itself doesn't participate in the democratic process. So the democratic process is a process which I would say, in the end, is the key process of decision-making on questions such as how much space do we give, to come back to the debate in the previous panel, to the arguments of the medical professions, for example, when it comes to dealing with COVID or when it comes to dealing with research, on the one hand, and the very legitimate concerns, let's say, of epidemiologists to know how the virus is spreading, and on the other hand, two arguments of those who say, well, if you create the perfect database from people's mobile phones where they are moving and how the virus is spreading based on this, and you centralize this database, it can be also used for terrible surveillance purposes of a dictatorship. And we have seen this great debate between different brands and strands of science. And the result, at least in Europe, was what I would call practical convergence. In the previous panel, we have talked about opposites, about the need to balance. Well, I would say it's not so much about opposites or need to balance. It is about the practical convergence. We need a maximum of a good functioning of democracy, a maximum of protection of fundamental rights, but also a maximum of growth and sustainable growth, obviously, and innovation for our societies to thrive. So it is not always helpful to discuss these matters as if they are mutually exclusive or as if we have to give priority to one over the other. So let me be very practical. The very precise answer to one of the questions raised in the previous panel, namely in medical science, how do we ensure the progress of medical science while protecting fundamental rights, for me, is that it is the legislator, the democratic legislator, which must set the rules which give practical concordance, on the one hand, to the importance, the great and overarching importance of medical research and medical knowledge in times, for example, of an epidemic which spreads, and on the other hand, how the concerns of individual rights of people are respected. So, to make this very practical, in our European General Data Protection Regulation, we have very strict rules on the protection of data, but we also have a very clear exemption in the moment when personal data is needed to fight an epidemic. We have very explicit wording in Article 9, where the legislator has said this interest overrides the interest of protection of personal data. And with the necessary securities, it is absolutely possible that the state requires that data is provided by doctors and even from people's mobile phones to follow the epidemic in such a situation. So I would also say that nothing in democracy, obviously, is perfect. All our laws in Europe are very painful compromises. We are now just going through the last stages of the negotiations of a regulation pertaining to AI, to artificial intelligence. We have now two positions on paper lying before us. In addition to the proposal of the European Commission, there is now the position of the European Parliament, which will soon be voted in plenary. I don't think it will change anymore. Last week, it was voted in committees. And we already have on paper the position of the European Council of Ministers, which represents the governments of the member states of the European Union, the 27 governments. So once both opinions are formally adopted, then the co-legislators, because the laws in Europe have to be adopted both by a majority of governments and by the majority of people represented in the European Parliament, will negotiate with each other a text on the artificial intelligence regulation. And so it is, on the one hand, a very transparent process. You can read these two opinions and then follow the compromise making between the co-legislators. But it is, of course, also a very difficult process in a vibrant democracy. We had more than 3,000 amendments in the democratic debate in the parliament. And taking account of all these requests for amendment, the parliament has finally found a common position. Now, let me say that these amendments, of course, have to do a lot with the question, who has power in society and how does the legislator allocate risks and opportunities in society. Let us be very clear. Many arguments which are being made, including on the panels such as the one we've heard before, and also any discussion on these matters, many arguments are influenced by special interest. You know, the people who are representing businesses, people who have an inherent interest in open source, on the medical profession. On the other hand, you know, you have other professions which have other interests. And let's not forget that in the background, the big players of personal data collection, like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, they all make their voices heard, and in a very, very sophisticated way. And they are not contenting themselves by speaking out transparently, open themselves, but they spend a lot of money to win over scientists and people who look independent, but actually preach what their business model interest is. And so in these discussions, I think it's always useful to ask the question whose interest is pursued, and also to follow the trail of the money. Many activities which look like a civil society activity, or for example, activities of small and medium businesses, are actually financed by these giants of the internet economy. And we have to get savvy about this. I have learned the term in 6 years of negotiation on GDPR. It was a very painful, hard process. I have learned the term astroturfing, which is a term of American lobbying, which describes the fact that the astroturf, it looks like grass, but it is no grass. It's plastic. And the reality is, in the political process in Brussels, we have seen, like in Washington, it is completely normal, also the arrival of astroturfing organizations which on the face of it look like civil society or small and medium enterprises, but actually are financed by the friends of AstroTurf, namely the GAFA. So this is what the debate is about. It's about power, business interests and profits on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is about making a democratic process work. Now, let me say a word about the role of ethics in this context. Nobody can have anything against ethics. But when ethics is used to talk down the law and say no to democratic lawmaking and say, well, you know, let's just stick with unbinding rules, then I think that is a maneuver which in itself is not ethical anymore. Because we live in a crisis of democracy, we must make democracy work. But also when we talk about big tech, we're talking about power. And it's one thing is clear. We need binding laws in this area, because the big players of big tech, they only react to the power of the law, if at all. So we need rules which have democratic legitimacy and which are binding for all, including those who don't want to play ball, and which therefore can be enforced through the power of the state. Leaving this space of digital power, which shapes all our lives, which shapes the functioning of democracy, which shapes whether or not we can benefit from our fundamental rights, only to ethics, to voluntary regulation or self-regulation, well, that may be the wet dream of some people in Silicon Valley, but that's not what democracy can be about. So it is very, very important that we all stand together and hold up democracy high. And it is, I say this also very clearly, it is important in these days to stop talking down democracy as an obstacle to innovation, as a cost factor, and so on. The reality and the experience of the greening of the economy, of working for sustainability is exactly the opposite. Without clear laws which orient innovation in a direction which is good for society, we will never manage all the environmental challenges and sustainable challenges which we have. And it is thanks to very strict laws, in particular in Europe, in particular, of course, in Germany and other countries which have started to produce technology which is green, and where business was forced to do this because the legislator wanted this, not the least because of a strong green political movement. We have seen that this is absolutely not detrimental to the economy, but on the contrary, huge profits have been made in this way and huge innovation has taken place, which is beneficial for mankind. And I think this experience must inform, and this will be my last words, this experience must inform how we move forward in relation to the rules for the digital economy, including AI. We must learn from the green experience. We must see that technology and business models must accept the primacy of democracy. We cannot live in a world which is mainly ruled only by business and profit interests. Well, let's say it this way, we can live in such a world, maybe, but that will not be a world which is sustainable. It will not be a world in which people still have a say about their lives. It will be a world in which we are completely controlled by the powers of technology and business models. And so in the end, what I'm talking about is also the need for people to engage for democracy and in democracy, and also for people to stand up to the claims, for example, that all problems of this world will be solved by technology. In the COVID crisis, we have seen very clearly that we all together have only been able to manage this crisis well in a good mix of technological innovation, namely the vaccines, many of which came from Europe, which, by the way, shows you again that the claim that because of the rule-making and law-making in Europe, we are not innovative in Europe is complete bullshit. The contrary is true. Our innovation is guided by democratic rules and therefore serves people, the vaccine being the best example, and a mix of behavioral rules, namely distancing, all wearing masks and so on which we had to agree in a democratic process. And of course, to some extent, also the app, the discussion on which the app, the notification apps on COVID, the discussion on which in itself is a great example how in free societies and in democratic processes, a practical concordance can be reached between different interests, in this case, in particular, different interests of different sciences. So let me conclude by saying the scarcest resource today in the scope of technology discussion is not the one great next technological idea or the great program, which solves all problems of this world. The greatest, scarcest resource is the ability and willingness of people to agree on things in democratic process. We have to relearn and re-engage in the democratic process, and we have to make it work also in the age of artificial intelligence. That is, I think, the experience of Europe, and this is what we are trying to do in Europe. Whether this will be successful or not, we will see. But the fact is we have rules on the book by law which are increasingly rigorously enforced on the protection of personal data, and the claim that that inhibits innovation is simply not true. But the innovation in Europe when it comes to personal data is fundamental rights friendly. And it is therefore, I would say, a better innovation for people than the innovation in China on personal data, which is about a dictatorship exerting power and herding its own people like sheep. And it's also a better innovation on personal data than in America, where the data model has been called by Al Gore the stalker economy. And the same is now happening on artificial intelligence. We are making a law which will be binding for all, which will set the rules. None of this is perfect, but I would say it is the most successful effort in democracy to move forward with these matters. And it is not a bad thing for Europe to be a leader in trying to use democratic tools and to make democracy work in the age of artificial intelligence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for your extremely passionate speech. I feel inspired to become a politician suddenly. No, but in all seriousness, our theme for Civil 20 is You Are the Light. And the reason that's the theme is because in this world where we feel like everything is just kind of going dark in a sense, everywhere you look there's a problem, we want to remember that each one of us, each civil society organization, each person, each student, each faculty, everyone is the light in the sense that we just have to do our best and step forward. And I think your call, what I really heard from your call today is that we need to be involved in our own governments and democracy in order to succeed, and we need to converge together. So thank you very, very much for your time, for your expertise, and for speaking with us today.
Thank you.